You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. In times of turmoil, and there has been plenty of it in the year 2024, in and out of Paris, we naturally seek sources of calm. We seek constants. And in Paris, there's perhaps nothing that recenters Parisians more than the Seine. The city's most iconic waterway has shaped its mythology long before there were tourist boats and selfie-taking travelers. Today, the significance of the Seine River is front and center again, thanks to the Olympics and a €1 billion cleanup project. To talk about all of that, I'm joined by my friend and fellow journalist, Mary Winston Nicklin, who reported National Geographic's cover story on the Seine earlier this year. We recorded this conversation at a cafe near the river, with the occasional chatty pedestrian or delivery person passing by. I hope this only adds to the color of our discussion. Mary, welcome to an off-site recording of The New Paris.
Love it. Thank you for having me.
We are sitting, where are we sitting? We are sitting at a cafe looking toward the Seine. We are basically as close as we can be without being on the riverbanks, right?
Yeah, the trees are changing color, which is beautiful to see.
Finally.
Yep.
It's really slow nowadays, I find. Slow as in later, you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's just late.
We've still got our palm trees.
We have these bizarre palm trees lining the Pont Louis-Philippe from the Olympics. And very close to us, we have influencers or some sort of photo campaign for God knows what with an oversized croissant.
It is so bizarre. I've never seen this before.
No. Well, but Paris is a backdrop for
It's true.
photo shoots and series and all sorts of things. But
And we're just curious if it's good. Can we go try it?
Something tells me it probably won't be. Also, after all those hands have touched it.
There you go.
Okay, so we're here in this location because I wanted to talk to you about the Seine. You are a journalist. You have written some massive features for The Washington Post, for Afar, and most recently for National Geographic. And this was the cover story. So as your friend, I think this is huge.
That's really cool of you. Thank you so much.
And it came out in July.
It was the August issue.
August issue.
And it was a good year project, actually. Our photographer, Thomas Van Houtryve, photographed the Seine for more than a year. And the whole point of the project really was to dive deep into the history and culture of the river, to give it context before the Olympics, because the river really served as center stage for the Olympics, the opening ceremony, and also because of the giant cleanup project,
right,
the equivalent of $1.5 billion that people have heard so much about. So that was our timely hook, but it was really, a deep dive into the history and culture, which I love, because for me, the Seine is it's like Paris in terms of just so many stories.
And that's what we're going to get to, because
Right.
I really want to understand where this mythology comes from. And also, we walk by the Seine, maybe not daily, but regularly. And I don't think we think about everything that it has to do and has done for the city and for its people. And so this cleanup project is really, part of, hopefully, a new era. But if we get into your story, you write that the Seine has been a conduit of civilization and French national identity, personified endlessly. We think of the river today in terms of Paris present, but it goes so far beyond that physically and historically. Can you talk about that mythology? Sort of, where did it come from?
Sure. So at first, I think it's important to look at the history of the river, because this history isn't the longest in France, nor is it the mightiest. But some of the most defining historic moments in the country's development happened on the Seine. So it's history, and then we'll get into culture. So, the city itself would not be Paris without the Seine. And then you have events like the Viking invasion of France, of Normandy, which a lot of people don't realize, which I hadn't realized, was so formative in the development of the country. We still have Viking place names cartographically on our maps, Honfleur. It's, for example, a Viking place. And so the Vikings had this outsized influence, and I think the Vikings themselves are such a fascinating subject because, there are a lot of stereotypes about these warring peoples, but they were actually, traveling through the rivers as far away as Iran, and there was a big cultural exchange, and so the Vikings brought a new way of thinking to France when they developed Normandy, basically. So that was the early 10th century when the first Duke of Normandy, he was a Viking chief, and his ancestors went on to conquer England. So the Vikings played an outsized role. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, her ashes thrown into the Seine. I like to think about Richard the Lionheart, his Chateau Gaillard, which is outside. It's not too far from Paris in Normandy. It's actually it's absolutely beautiful. It's up on a cliff top overlooking the river. You can see the white cliffs in the distance. And when that chateau fell, that was the end of the Angevin Empire, which is the Plantagenets. This was an entire dynasty that was stronger, more powerful than France at that moment in time. So Eleanor of Aquitaine's descendants, Richard the Lionheart, this kingdom was more important for me than France was at the time. So when that fell to Philip Auguste, that was huge for the Franks, right? So there are all these formative moments that have happened on the banks of the Seine. And then when we get into the culture, that's a whole nother topic. Basically, cultural movements like Impressionism were born from the Seine. The painters who were escaping Paris, escaping Haussmann's renovations of Paris.
The artists, you mean the painters were?
Oh, yeah. And the Seine was this, endless inspiration. And what was so interesting in their work was sort of this fusion of industry and nature that I think of when I think of the Seine today, the most urbanized river in France. There's these constant you see often this contrast between nature and industry, this coexistence. And the Impressionists, that the painting that launched the entire movement was the smokestacks against the sunrise in Le Havre that Claude Monet painted.
Which is also where the Seine connects to.
Exactly.
It goes far beyond Paris.
So the Impressionist movement is just one example of many cultural. You have New Wave cinema. There's a mill called the Moulin d'Andé, which is where a lot of, it's sort of an artist retreat now. And this is where Truffaut filmed Julie and Jim. This is where a lot of that, so you have New Wave cinema, you've got the Impressionists, you've got, not too far from Fontainebleau, you have Django Reinhardt, the classical guitarist.
Yep.
Who
also has a festival every year,
exactly.
which I went to this year.
Oh, and how was that?
It was amazing. And, you get the sense that it's a way to start seeing how the past informs so very deeply the present and the future. But at what point did the Seine become commercial? Because you wrote about Haussmann, and you just mentioned Baron Haussmann as being something that someone and his innovations that the artists wanted to flee. But his sewer system that he developed, or he put someone in charge of, actually executing, was hugely important in the chronology of events. Right. And yes, if you hear noises, it's because we are outside, and there are trucks and people unhappy in their cars when other cars are blocking. Anyway, so at what point did it become commercial, and why was this ultimately the sewer system? Why was it a huge innovation, but one that was ultimately bad for the river's health? I found that so fascinating.
Right, interesting. So to answer the first part of that question, which is commercial, which I think of also as river transport. And if we're to talk about that aspect of the river, that commercial aspect of the river, it's been since the earliest days of humans living on the river, really. The Notes, which were a group of a guild of boatsmen in the early days of Lutetia, that's what they did. That's why they were powerful, because they had control of the river commerce and river transport. And one of the symbols of Paris is an actual pillar that they gave to the emperor, this pillar that you can see in the Cluny Museum. So that shows sort of the importance of the river commercially since, the early centuries.
So that's interesting. I definitely
Yeah.
didn't think of it in that way.
But regarding the sewer system, so
Yeah.
that's an entirely different question. So the river, if we look at the river's health today, so basically we love the river, but we've also hated it over time. Not hated it, but we've dumped in it, right?
Which is
So
a
it served
disrespect
as a
for
dumping
it.
ground, right? But if you look at, I mean, it's fascinating to look at the archaeological record of what's been thrown in the river, what's been found in the river, because this shows great veneration. Like, you know, the knights, the crusaders going off to the Holy Lands would throw talismans and good luck talismans before they started out on their journeys. There were offerings like that, but you also have trash. You know, and I spent a lot of time with the Pompiers who are stationed on their floating fire department down near Le Monnet.
I loved when you told me this is what you were doing. You're like, I cannot come out. I have to hang out with the firemen.
Oh, I loved it. Oh my God, I loved it. I spent a couple of days with these guys, and they find a lot of stuff still, you know, dumped in the river.
Like,
I mean,
what kind of horrible things?
Well,
Aside from bodies, which I'm sure
that's
have
happened.
been found.
That has happened. You know, things like your stupid e-cigarette, whatever.
Oh, the vapor.
Yeah.
Things.
Whatever they're called.
Right.
The
e-cigarette
yes.
things. We're not smokers, clearly.
No. What else? Digital camera batteries, like things that are just like annoying. But they've also found things like arms, you know, guns from World War II and things like
wow.
Yeah. There's a whole collection. And there's a whole collection of those kinds of things.
That is wild.
So wait, back to, so over time, we have used the river as a dumping ground. But this didn't matter really historically when the population was low.
Right.
But what you have in the 19th century with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution is this huge, I mean, I think it doubled. It was like 1 to 2 million in a matter of years in the 19th century. And Paris was suffering these cholera outbreaks. I mean, it was really, really filthy when you think about what Haussmann had to handle. I mean, the city's sanitation was serious. It was really, really, really unhealthy.
Yeah, people forget that part of, I mean, maybe they don't, but I think when you're walking through Paris, I find it interesting to remember all of the very unseemly and really appalling moments in its history where the population was being, you know, just annihilated by virus and by illness, disease.
Absolutely. And what we think of as charming today,
right.
like the winding medieval streets, which
right.
I love, I can't get enough of, but it was really, really unhealthy. Really unhealthy. Damp and... Anyway, Haussmann opened it all up. He brought in, he had his engineer Belgrand, who brought in fresh water and also devised a sewer system. Now, Paris had had a sewer system since Roman times, and if you go down the sewer museum, you can see this. I mean, they were building on vestiges over time, but the most important sewer system, what we still use today, was built in the 19th century, and this was really revolutionary at the time. But what it does, and what a lot of sewer systems do, is it collects wastewater and rain runoff into the same system.
So it was not doing what we're going to get to the new system,
right.
obviously, but it does not do what we realized needed to be done. You cannot put those two in the same.
Right. I mean, today we also see the virtues of collecting rainwater, right?
Sure, for other purposes.
Exactly.
But not for the health of people.
Right. But at the time, this was amazing because they could cart away. That's not the right word. You can direct the sewage away from the citizens of Paris, which had immediate impact on the health of the city. However, I should say a lot of waste was still used as fertilizer at this point in time. So people for centuries understood the merits of saving and recycling stuff. And today we still recycle a lot of the stuff at the treatment plants. It's fascinating. They're really high tech and they try to reuse as much material as possible.
Okay, that's
good. Which is really cool to see. But so a lot of this waste was collected and put on the plains of Saint-Denis, where there were a lot of farms to feed the city of Paris.
Right. You have to remember that long before it was basically the most densely populated, suburb around Paris, it was farmland.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's remarkable. And you can still see traces of it today. Those market gardeners that supplied the city. But I should add back to the sewer system. So some of that waste was collected, but then a lot of it was also dumped downstream.
Did they not have the understanding of what would happen if they did that?
I just think, who could have predicted how many millions of people live in this Paris region
okay, that's
today?
fair, right.
That's what I think.
You're making decisions based on what you have the
What you
ability to know.
Exactly.
But then again, you think about how Paris always saw itself as this grand power. I don't know. Maybe I'm completely off base thinking that their ambitions were for it to be a highly populous capital, but maybe that's completely false.
Well, I think about it being, the capital of Europe from the Middle Ages. So it's always had this powerful, but whether, I don't know. In my reporting, I didn't find any, the reasons why we dumped downstream and thought that was okay to put our mess downstream. Right. I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
But my guess is we didn't think that the consequences were as serious as we see today.
So when did those consequences start to become very apparent?
Well, so the health, and that's another question I know you have between the words health and clean when we talk about a river. Right.
So that was such a fascinating distinction you made in the story.
For me too. It really is. So if we think about the health of a river, we're talking about what's living in it, the species living in it. So the real terrible, it wasn't until I'd say the 1960s when things were dire, when there was virtually nothing left living in the river. This was not necessarily from our sewage wastewater, but factory dumping.
Right, because that was the other part of, it's not just, what doesn't get sort of divided up or removed in the sewage system. It's also, then you have these factories and and big business coming in.
So this is so toxic, the discharges these factories were putting into the river. So toxic. And there was no oversight of this stuff back in the day. I mean, all over the world.
Right, not just Paris.
Right.
It's worth
So I think there was a real reckoning. I mean, we think about when the environmental movement really started. We're talking 1960s. I look at Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, as really a wake-up call for the state of the environment that really had long-term sort of effects. I think the word pollution, as we use it today, wasn't really coined until the 1960s.
Interesting.
Or the way we think about it,
or the way
today.
we know about it.
Right. So the river, it was really bad. I mean, you'd see just imagine like dead fish and just like scum floating on the surface of the water. Like just really, really awful.
And that carried on until today, right?
That was for decades. So some of the people I interviewed for this story, I mean, who grew up here on the Seine, I mean, they just remember it being a cesspool. Just
who did you?
Absolutely.
Are you talking about residents that you interviewed?
Oh,
who live
residents, but also scientists and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, who have just grown up in this area. So it was just really gross. So back to what it means to have a healthy river. What's living in the river? So at that time, it was nearly biologically dead, we can say. We only had a couple species of fish that could resist pollution, that could live. There's no oxygen in there. They can't live in this environment. And so it was in the early 1990s when EU legislation put into place, rules across Europe. Wastewater has to be treated, basically.
So that was 1991, if I remember from your story. And what else did it entail?
So it's basically, as I understand, it was rules for collection, treatment, and discharge of wastewater. So I just don't think that there had been any, I don't have the technical in terms of that kind of information, but it was really a mandate that this stuff had to be taken care of, right? So
whereas before it was not.
Right. So I think this was huge. This was a huge thing. It was the beginning, as I say, as the tide started to turn for the health of the river at that point in time. And now, today, we have something like nearly 40 species of fish living in the Paris region.
But is that just since this cleanup project, or was that sort of before? Is that since 1991?
Well, so there have been strides on the plan to clean up the river, which we talked about during the Olympics a lot. Yeah. A lot of people, a lot of TV viewers, especially in the United States, thought that the whole point of the plan was just for the Olympics. No. For me, this is a long-term plan that was put in place nearly 10 years ago.
Yeah, you talk about 2015 and the Plan Baignade that led to the Olympics, and then they it sort of accelerated with the Olympics.
Exactly. So the Olympics was really an accelerator, and it was also, one of the deputy mayors says that it sped it up by 10 years, he'd guess.
Wow.
That Olympics. And it was part of the winning bid.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, they knew they had to pitch that as part of the...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it had never been done before, and I think Paris really did an amazing job.
But so what does that entail then? Because, I mean, we hear about the cleanup program, and now that we're far removed from the Olympics, it's worth reminding people because I think it got lost in a lot of the Olympics coverage. So
it was frustrating for me because I saw a lot of negative coverage. I mean, there were reporters talking about the color of the water as an indicator. I'm like, no, that has to do with sediment after rain. It actually doesn't have to do with the health of the water. There was also some scaremongering with some headlines, I think back in February, about, dire test results. And I'm thinking to myself, the river, the whole point is we're not swimming in February.
Right.
February is when we have our most rain. Rain is when we get the bad bacteria. I mean, anyway.
And so the cleanup plan is supposed to make sure that we can treat that properly.
Right. So the cleanup plan, which has been happening since 2015, is a mass mobilization of upstream townships and also Paris in a couple different ways. One is infrastructure upgrades, right? So we have this dual sewage system historically where stormwater and wastewater are funneled into the same place. In times of heavy rain, our sanitation system would open the valves into the Seine so that we wouldn't have overflow into the streets, right? So that's when you get the bad bacteria, the E. coli, which can make the river unhealthy. Right. And that's what we're cleaning. That's what cleaning the river means.
But also unhealthy
the bad bacteria.
For water
or for
life.
Swimming.
Or just for swimming. Because it's this word, right? Clean versus healthy. If E. coli gets in the water, that's got to be bad for...
I think it's really the factory pollutants that are really bad. So this massive mobilization effort with the upstream townships, a lot of houses had not been hooked up to the sewer system, believe it or not, on the Marne and upstream. Right. So these houses, it was grandfathered in, had been dumping their sewage directly into the river. So you have that. You had Paris houseboats.
Right. I thought about those.
Yep, that had to be hooked up. They were not hooked up necessarily before. Crazy to think about. But sort of the bigger efforts were at treatment plants. CEAP, which manages the whole sort of Parisian system, has done incredible technological upgrades. There are a lot of new collectors, and the tank that I write about in this story, which I went down inside, and it's just pretty phenomenal. There's a tank on the left bank that can hold the equivalent of 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools of rainwater, stormwater, when those big, massive downpours happen, thus preventing it from getting flooded into our sewer system.
And then what happens with that?
So that is slowly filtered back after the rains have subsided, slowly filtered back into the sewer system, and it goes to our treatment plants.
Wow.
Right. So it's really technical. And I tell you, when I was down there, I was having all these epiphanies about France as this country of engineers. I mean, I think this was one of my biggest takeaways from doing this story. From the beginning of time, really, the human habitation along the Seine, we've engineered this river, almost to death, right? Think about the bridges, the locks, the quays. Upstream, we have a bunch of lakes constructed to keep Paris from flooding. That's another topic we can get into.
Yeah.
But anyway, over the course of history, we have engineered this river in a crazy way. And now finally, we're using human engineering to go in the different direction to bring it back to life. So for me, this was the most incredible takeaway. And to see it was more than 40 engineers who worked on this project. It's incredible.
40?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And hundreds of people working in there. And Paris is just if you look underground, how densely...
That's the other thing people don't realize is, we spend our time above ground. And I guess if you've been to the catacombs or you've been to maybe even the sewage museum, right? Or you can tour this sort of thing. But for the most part, aside from the metro, we're not really spending any time uncovering the other side of our lives here that operates
and it's
behind the scenes.
Incredibly complex. And it layers underground in terms of metro, sewers, electrical cables, heating.
It's like the further down you go,
the further you get into history. I don't know.
Absolutely.
It's sort of, that's my initial
Well,
reaction.
and most often the archaeological digs that happen as a result of this stuff is so
Oh, for
cool.
sure they must discover
It's
things.
amazing. So I asked the guys for this project, and they didn't. It was in a particular area that hadn't really been. It was outside of sort of the Roman areas of the Latin Quarter. But in general, yeah. I mean, any hotel to dig in a swimming pool, you often
Right,
find.
must come up with things for sure.
Yeah, you come up with really cool stuff.
Now that you say that, maybe that's why certain hotels have opted against a swimming pool, not just for the issue of space,
totally.
but because maybe
It sets you back many months, sometimes a year, when you have to call in the.
it's like look at
teams.
Rome right now is preparing for the Jubilee, next year, and mass construction everywhere, and I know that they get delayed because, like, you knock one thing and you discover something completely historic that needs to be analyzed and preserved.
Absolutely.
So we're working within such, just such a it's like a history book come to life, and you have to operate within that and be mindful, because you can't just sort of forge ahead.
Yeah.
But to your point, you mentioned rainwater. And flooding. Sorry, you mentioned flooding. And the cistern at Gare d'Austerlitz, that's where the tank is that you visited, correct?
Yes. It's near the hospital there.
Can that tackle issues like flooding? Can it tackle climate change issues?
No. So I asked them. So this was one of my biggest discoveries researching this story. The cleanup project, we still have work to do. I don't want to say it's perfect.
No.
I don't know. We still have work to do. However, if you look at where the Seine was 10 years ago, it's remarkable. I mean, when Arthur Germain, the son of Anne Hidalgo, swam the entire length of the river in 2021, he found the Seine was healthy. He was taking readings every couple kilometers along the way. He only found like 4 readings of bad bacteria, and this was back before any of the cleanup project news went public or anything like that. Like, we've made significant strides.
And just as an aside, our friend Sarah Lieberman wrote a story following Arthur back when he was doing that swim, and I'm going to include the article in the show notes in the description if listeners want to read.
Yeah, he's a tremendous guy.
I mean, Sarah, just a fascinating story, right?
It's an awesome story. Really, really cool story. But he was motivated by environmental reasons for doing that swim, really, to call attention to, in his words, that the Seine isn't just a trash can. And that's how I
shouldn't
feel
be
about
one
it.
to begin with.
No. So you had asked about
flooding.
So for me, realizing that this cleanup project has had tremendous progress, and that cities around the world have been watching this. There are other cities that wish to embark on cleanup projects. Washington, D.C. comes to mind, and I think it's twice as expensive as the Seine project so far, what they've been putting into it. Yeah.
Really?
Oh. Or over time it will be. It's over a 20-year period. So it's, yeah. But there are other cities that are looking and inspired by this, and I think it's a very positive environmental message for me in this bleak environmental newscape.
Yeah.
Yes,
but that doesn't mean that if what we're starting to see over the last couple of years is that maybe for Western Europe and Paris in particular, much like what we're seeing this year with Spain, that climate change, what that looks like for us is heavier storms and a lot more rain. And so these tanks are not going to be able to accommodate flooding to the degree that we might be exposed to it.
Right. So that was not their intention at all. And I point blank asked the engineers, no, absolutely not. It can't handle it. So those lakes that I mentioned, flooding has always been a historic Paris problem. We've had flooding since,
like biblical floods, right?
Exactly, yes.
But
like
what was that,
1910,
right? Okay.
Yes, and we still see some of the marks, etched on city walls, city fountains where those water levels came in 1910. Like it was, and the vintage postcards are extraordinary, seeing these people boating across down streets. So when I was researching this story, what I realized is that the dangers of flooding with climate change are really actually the bigger, sort of scarier subject. Yeah. So, and the reason actually that we had issues starting the Olympics was some of the events postponed because the the bacteria levels were too high when they did the water readings. Paris 2024 and World Triathlon were following the protocols about what it could be. The reasons that we had some issues was because of the rains. And this is climate change because usually we have dry summers. Historically, yes. And what climate change has unleashed is freak downpours of intense. And that is what is totally unpredictable. I mean, we've just seen it in Spain.
Exactly. That's what I mean. I mean, and we saw it here this time last year. Northern France was already getting pummeled, and these villages are going to become uninhabitable.
Exactly.
Condemned.
Yes. So the bigger issue for me, so the lakes that have been engineered outside of Paris upstream to hold back the Seine, to basically regulate the river water level.
Right.
Is that going to be sufficient? So there was a fascinating film director that I interviewed for this piece who his documentary film is called, translated, When the Seine Overflows. And basically...
Reassuring.
I know. When he started researching the topic, he thought it was a classic sort of subject, Seine flooding. But what he realized is that there are entire institutions, there are groups of engineers working for the RATP, all these other organizations, working on nightmare scenarios, like what do we do? Because it could and it will happen in terms of, a deluge of rainwater.
Well, and we need those mines to fix to solve this.
So for me, the Seine is really facing an uphill battle when it comes to climate change. Climate change is the bigger, scary
story.
Yes.
So what I like is that you gave us a lot of positive things to think about and to talk about, because you were correct that, this cleanup came at a time when people were looking for negative things to cover about the Olympics. And I certainly wasn't the biggest champion of the Olympics before it kicked off, right? But I at least knew enough because, I live here. And so I was able to sort of see the benefit of this cleanup. But for a foreign audience, I think it's important to reiterate how important this project was.
Definitely.
and remains.
On that note, can I say it's not just fish species, but we've also seen an incredible increase in the number of nesting birds on the Seine.
Interesting.
Population of seals in the estuary that hadn't been there some years ago. So it's brought back to life and really made this an ecological corridor, as it's always been historically. Why does this matter? Why does biodiversity matter? Because it's very air we breathe and water we drink. I mean, as human, this is all important for our ecosystems, right? So for me, that the story of the return of the biodiversity of the Seine, it's really important.
It's about our survival, essentially.
And also, if you take it from a cultural standpoint, people have been swimming in the Seine forever. So the fact that we should be able to swim next year in the summer.
So that is still ongoing. That plan is ongoing.
Yes, there will be 3 places to swim, and I plan to swim. They're going to test the water daily. I trust it.
Okay.
And this is another sort of response to climate change that the city is putting in place.
Well, we need a way to cool down, right? For sure.
In a city that doesn't use air conditioning, we need a place to go, cool off.
Assuming that we do get heat waves again. We've had spurts, a few days here and there, but we haven't had the true heat wave we had, even a few years ago in Paris, where it lasted over a week, over 40 degrees Celsius. That is not to say one is less destructive, because they both are, but I think everyone assumed, that's the path much of France is taking. But in fact, in the last couple of years, it's been rain. So I think the idea is we don't fully know, but we need to be prepared for everything. If listeners can look at the Seine in a new way when they visit Paris, what would you suggest they pay attention to?
Well, I love Arthur Germain's, it's not a trash can. This river is the vital lifeblood, not just of culture and a civilization, but for an ecosystem.
When they're looking at it, just remember that it serves this bigger purpose. When you're walking around now, what do you think of, besides the engineers behind it and all of that? How did it change your relationship to the river,
I think
reporting this story?
The river, for those of us who live here and a lot of visitors, I mean, the Seine is just, I've always found it a very calming, sort of steadfast source. And I think this made me really think about it as a living thing, too. That all the stuff living in there, I mean, I love that there's a giant catfish living underneath it's an invasive species, but it's the mascot of the firemen.
Where is it living?
Under their floating fire station.
You're kidding.
They call him Roger. Yeah, he's like, I love thinking about what's living in there. And the divers, there are divers in both the police and the pompiers who go down there all the time. And it's thinking about this being, a living, sacred entity too, if we think about its earliest mythology as a river goddess.
So these are all things people can think about, maybe.
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
take a moment to think about that when they're strolling along the Seine and looking and thinking perhaps, oh, it's just a river. It's not just a river.
Right. Well, and it's also, I mean, we gravitate to the Seine. We can't help it. People take selfies. We do boat rides. That's a thing we do as tourists here. And it's thinking about how this city, improbably, years ago, when Chirac said, I'm going to swim in the Seine, he couldn't believe it. It was finally a mayor on another side of the political aisle that fulfilled that promise. Look at what can happen politically when you put your mind to it. We can achieve great things. We can, clean up a river that was so filthy and disgusting that no one would, I mean, I look at it now and I think it looks great. Yes, there's some floating gross things sometimes, but
but for the
most
most
part, it's like, wow, isn't that great?
And isn't it phenomenal what we can do when we put our minds
totally
and investment towards something that
exactly
can benefit?
Yeah.
Mary, what incredible reporting.
Thank
Seriously,
you.
What a phenomenal
so
story.
Much.
And for those who want to read the story, you have to track down this issue of National Geographic from August.
Yes.
There is an online version. I know that's not the complete version. It was obviously trimmed for web. But really, everything Mary just said is part of the story. So you've already gotten to hear from the source more about the river than maybe you knew before. And go forth and think about all of it on your next visit. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a real treat. Thank you.
That's the show for today. Thanks for listening, as always. If you're streaming this on Spotify, be sure to check out a little poll that awaits you pertaining to this discussion. Just scroll down on the episode page within the app and vote. And if you enjoy the show, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, share with a friend, and pick up the books that inspired it, The New Paris and The New Parisienne. Until next time, à bientôt.